London, 1888. The fog hung heavy in the air, a dense shroud that seemed to stifle even the faintest sound. Whitechapel was a maze of narrow streets and dark alleys, and I, Detective Edward Mitchell, had been prowling them for weeks. There was something malevolent in the air, a palpable sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Though officially off duty, my instincts had driven me to hunt for the source of these whispers of terror. On the night of August 31st, my unease reached a climax. As I wandered the dimly lit streets of Bucks Row, a sudden piercing police whistle shattered the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted towards the source of the sound, dread pooling in my stomach. What I found will haunt me for the rest of my days. Mary Ann Nichols lay sprawled on the cold, unforgiving ground. The sight of her lifeless body, bathed in the weak glow of a nearby gas lamp, was more horrific than anything I had ever encountered. Her throat had been slashed twice, deep and brutal. The cuts were so savage that they nearly severed her head from her body. Blood pooled around her, dark and viscous, soaking into the cobblestones. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I took in the full extent of the carnage. Her abdomen had been ruthlessly mutilated, slashed open with a ferocity that defied comprehension. Intestines spilled from the gaping wounds, a grotesque testament to the killer's monstrous intent. The smell of blood and entrails filled the air, mingling with the damp fog to create a miasma of death and decay. "Dear God," I muttered, bile rising in my throat. This was no mere murder. This was the work of a fiend, a creature of pure evil. I scanned the surrounding shadows, my eyes straining to penetrate the fog, but saw nothing. The killer had vanished into the night, leaving only horror in his wake. I knew then that I was alone in this. My superiors would never understand the depths of my obsession, my relentless need to bring this madman to justice. They would dismiss me as paranoid, unhinged. No, I had to keep this investigation to myself. I had to hunt the Ripper alone. Back in my modest flat, I pored over my notes, the flickering candle casting eerie shadows on the walls. I mapped out the locations, the dates, the grotesque details of each attack. This killer had a pattern, a method. Each murder was more savage, more calculated. The fear in Whitechapel was palpable, a living, breathing entity that fed on the terror of its inhabitants. Mary Ann Nichols' lifeless eyes haunted my thoughts, her silent scream for justice echoing in my mind. I vowed to her, to myself, that I would not rest until I caught the Ripper. The fog outside thickened, mirroring the darkness that clouded my thoughts. But within that darkness burned a fierce resolve. I had to stop the Ripper, no matter the cost. As I stared at the gruesome details laid out before me, I felt a surge of determination. This monster, this butcher, would not go unpunished. I would delve into the darkest corners of Whitechapel, confront the horrors that lay hidden, and bring this fiend to justice. I remember the first reports that reached my ears. Whispers of a maniac prowling the streets targeting the most vulnerable. I brushed them off initially, attributing them to the usual tales that emerged from the underbelly of this city. But as the days turned into nights and the nights grew colder, those whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could feel the fear in the air, a tangible, oppressive force. It was on one such night, the moon barely a sliver in the sky, that the first scream shattered my complacency. A shrill, gut-wrenching scream that cut through the fog like a knife. I raced towards the sound, my pulse quickening with each step. And then I saw her, Mary Ann Nichols, a familiar face among the unfortunate souls of Whitechapel. But now she was unrecognizable. Her body lay discarded, as if it were nothing more than refuse. Her eyes stared blankly at the heavens, wide open in eternal terror. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that it was a wonder her head was still attached. Blood had soaked her dress, pooled around her, a dark halo of death, and her abdomen. I could barely look. It had been savagely torn open, organs exposed to the cold night air. I felt a sickness rise within me, a mixture of horror and fury. Who could do this? What kind of beast could carry out such an atrocity? I looked around, desperate for any clue, any sign of the monster who had done this. But the fog was thick, the night silent save for the distant sounds of the city that seemed oblivious to the horror that had unfolded. I knew then that this was no ordinary killer. This was someone who reveled in the pain and fear of others, who found pleasure in the most grotesque acts of violence. And I knew with a sinking feeling that this would not be the last. Mary Ann Nichols was only the beginning. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the investigation, but I kept my suspicions, my fears to myself. My superiors were quick to dismiss the idea of a serial killer, attributing the murder to a random act of violence. But I knew better. I had seen the look in Mary Ann's lifeless eyes, the sheer brutality of the wounds. This was no random act. This was calculated, deliberate, the work of a true monster. Every night I walked the streets of Whitechapel, my senses on high alert. I spoke to the residents, the ones who dared to venture out after dark. I listened to their stories, their fears. And slowly, a picture began to form. A shadowy figure, always lurking, always just out of sight. A man with a dark coat and a glint of madness in his eyes. But despite my best efforts, the Ripper remained elusive. He was a ghost, slipping through the cracks, leaving only death in his wake. And with each new victim, the fear grew. The people of Whitechapel were terrified, and I felt their fear like a weight on my shoulders. I had to stop this. I had to bring this madman to justice. Mary Ann Nichols became my obsession. I spent hours studying the crime scene, looking for anything that might have been missed. A footprint, a stray hair, anything. But the Ripper was careful, methodical. He left nothing behind, save for the mangled bodies of his victims. Mary Ann Nichols became my obsession. I spent hours studying the crime scene, looking for anything that might have been missed. A footprint, a stray hair, anything. But the Ripper was careful, methodical. He left nothing behind, save for the mangled bodies of his victims. I began to lose myself in the hunt, my nights consumed by the chase, my days filled with the gruesome details of the murders. I barely slept, the faces of the victims haunting my dreams. And through it all, the specter of Mary Ann Nichols loomed largest. Her death was the spark that ignited my obsession, and I could not let it go. One night, as I walked the familiar streets, I found myself back at Buck's Row, the place where it had all begun. The fog was thick, the air cold and damp. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where Mary Ann had been found. I could still see her, the horror of that night replaying in my mind. I made a silent vow to her, to all the victims. I would not rest until the Ripper was caught. I would delve into the darkest corners of Whitechapel, confront the horrors that lay hidden, and bring this fiend to justice. The hunt had begun, and I was ready. Mary Ann Nichols would not be forgotten. She was the first, but she would not be the last. And with each step I took, I moved closer to the shadowy figure known as Jack the Ripper. The nights ahead would be long and filled with horror, but I would face them unflinchingly. The Ripper's reign of terror would end. By my hand, it would end.